It can be difficult to let go of the past, especially if that past won't let go of you. That is what our story is about tonight. It is a tale known as The Last Night.
Dennis paced around the living room of his house. He wanted to drink. He wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything. And yet, there he was, doing nothing. He wasn't even completely sure what to do. Nathan had always been the decision maker. But Nathan wasn't there anymore. Part of him almost thought it was amusing, in a horrid sort of way. 6 years ago, they didn't even know each other. Of course, that was because the world only ended 5 years ago. He looked outside at the hideous sun, nothing more than a looming black dot against the blue sky. That was how they met. They were both about to go home from their overnight shift at the munitions factory when the sun changed and everything went mad. First it was the animals, then the people, and then the dead. The bus that was bringing them back to their neighborhood got overturned. At the time, they didn't even know each other's name. But using a tire iron to save someone from a rabid dog helps to break the ice with new friends. Dennis never told Nathan, but he kept a score of all the times they saved each other's lives. Dennis was down 10 to 12, but for all the heroics they traded, both came up short by the time they made it to their houses. The worst part was how both of their families weren't ripped apart by walking corpses or unnameable things. Their wives, their children, all died at human hands. Panicked, frightened looters who could sense the doom that was shining down from the sky. He looked around the room he was in. This wasn't even his house. It was just the one they both agreed was the most defensible. For 5 years they survived here. Nathan was the leader. He had experience. He fought in the war. All Dennis ever was a simple employee. And now, he was alone. The morning had started like any other. They went out to find supplies. Nathan found a body, and thinking it was dead, started to search it. He was right that it was dead, but it was not a normal corpse. It was one of those things. Nathan had called them Seekers. He thought zombie or ghoul was too typical. They'd never seen one lying in wait before. They weren't that smart, but that one was. And it managed to bite Nathan on the side of the head, ripping his right ear off. After shooting the thing and making sure it was truly dead, Nathan handed his gear over to Dennis and told him to go on without him. He didn't want Dennis to see it, because he knew there was only one way to prevent contamination. Dennis did as he was told, and soon he heard a single gunshot. Part of him wanted to go back, but he knew the gunshot would attract other things, and besides, the only thing to recover would be the gun anyway. So there he was, back in their shelter, with enough gear and supplies for 2 men, and no bloody idea what to do next. He looked down at his own gun and wondered if maybe Nathan had the right idea. He found himself staring down at the pistol. His hands were shaking, and then he threw it on the ground. No, that wouldn't be how this ends. He didn't lose his family, suffer for 5 years, then lose his best friend, just to drop dead in some unknown person's house. He couldn't stay, though. Nathan's memories would be too much of a distraction, and the area was becoming more dangerous. Seekers had begun moving in greater numbers, and that wasn't even to mention the strange other creatures that would attack anything on sight. A few days ago, a group of travelers passed through the area. They claimed they were fleeing from the border of Mexico. They mentioned a sanctuary city had fallen there. The Seekers completely overran it. They called it a necropolis now. They were betting that it would be better to head east. Maybe that was what he should do. It was too late in the day to risk travel, though. The sunlight kept the Seekers busy, but once it got dark, there'd be nothing to stop them from running him down. He had to hold up one last night in this house, and then make his move with the first rays of dawn. He traced the steps he and Nathan had taken every day to secure the house. Any light that could be seen from outside was off. Every door was braced and locked. He made any food that would require warmth, and there was a part of him that felt Nathan would be proud of him. He was able to lock the whole house down. He wondered if maybe he could stay there after all. But then he caught a glimpse of himself in the bathroom mirror, and for one painful second, he thought he saw Nathan in the reflection. He sat down on the couch that they had sat on and eaten dinner together for 5 years. And finally, with all his prep work done, with his plans laid out for tomorrow, he gave himself permission to finally weep for his friend, until he fell asleep for the few hours he would have before darkness would fall. He woke with a start, hearing a noise outside. It was well past sundown, which meant the Seekers were out, doing the only thing they seemed to know how to do, crying and screaming as they shuffle around looking for any source of light. That's why Nathan called them that. At first he thought it was funny, the idea of zombies who were afraid of the dark. But Nathan theorized it wasn't that they were afraid, it was that some part of their rotting brains remembered that people used light, and people were their food source. Nathan always told Dennis, if there's only 2 things you ever remember, make them where you shit and where you eat. Though he'd never seen one of them shit. Dennis allowed himself to laugh softly at the memory until a troubling thought crept over him. The noise, the sound of them screaming had stopped. He dared to peek outside the window and almost cursed aloud. He had forgotten a light. The porch light. And now, at least a dozen Seekers were huddled around the back door, each trying to stand as close to the light as possible. Dennis could feel his heart pound in his chest. The slightest sound, the dimmest light could set them off. And while the door was braced, and it could easily hold one of them, a full pack would have no trouble brute forcing their way in. He quietly inched over to the door. The light switch was on his side. He prayed to anything that could be listening that just flipping the light switch off would make them go away, and then took a deep breath and turned it off. All at once, the Seekers started to scream. They sounded absolutely terrified. Dennis tensed up. Their noise would draw attention. Thinking fast, he turned the light back on, and they all fell silent. He needed them to go away, and if possible, be noisy somewhere else. Then he got an idea. These things, for whatever reason, wanted to be as close as possible to any light they could find. Maybe there was a way to use that against them. He searched through his supplies and found exactly what he needed: a lighter. He thanked goodness that Nathan never stopped smoking, in spite of all the times Dennis warned him about how it would kill him. Then he went back to the door and slowly opened it just wide enough that his hand could fit through. The Seekers were still looking up at the light, oblivious to what he was doing. Part of him wondered just how much he'd have to actually do in order to draw their attention to him, but this was not the time for experimenting with the damn things. Instead, he stuck his hand out and lit the lighter, holding its flame against the clothes of one of the creatures. Luckily, it was dry enough that it ignited. Dennis pulled his hand back in and held the door shut while the creature looked down at the fire. It screamed and started running around the yard, waving its arms around, as the fire slowly crept up its legs. The other Seekers looked, then started to scream too. Each one ran over to the one that was on fire, just as Dennis had hoped. They all wanted to be as close as possible to this new light source, and in less than a minute, the whole group were on fire, flailing and screeching, until a huge four-legged beast pounced down upon them, almost as if it fell out of the sky. It jumped from one to the next, ripping each Seeker limb from limb. Nathan had never given those kind of creatures a name. He would always just shout to shoot the damn thing. A lot. Dennis wondered if it maybe had once been a bear, or at least was descended from such a creature. All anyone really knew about those kind of monsters was that they showed up just months after the sun turned black. Some claimed they mutated from other life forms, while others swore they came down from the sun itself. What was absolutely certain about them was that they would attack anything on sight. Seekers, humans, even each other, and that small wounds were not enough to kill them. They seemed to grow and heal as quickly as they could be cut or shot. The only way to make sure they would stay down was to wound one in such a way that it couldn't regrow. Dennis just had to wait until it finished killing all the Seekers. Then it would get bored and wander off. At least, that was what he told himself. Sadly, the thing seemed to find amusement in rolling around in the gore that it had made out of the Seekers. As Nathan always said, nothing is easy anymore. He sat there, braced against the door, for probably an hour before anything changed, trying to think of some way to make it leave, when suddenly he heard gunfire. He looked out the window and saw a figure wearing military armor and a gas mask, shooting at the beast with a rifle that was almost as long as he was tall. The beast was bloodied and flailed around on the ground. The figure then threw a strange thick substance over it. Whatever it was, it seemed to work. The beast slowly stopped thrashing and melted into a foul-smelling pile of goo. The figure called out with a muffled voice for occupants. Dennis wasn't sure what to do. Nothing was really trustworthy anymore. It wouldn't be the first time someone had helped him, just to point a gun in his face a moment later. The figure shouted that he was from Fort Belford, and that anyone inside needed to come with him immediately. The army was planning a retreat. Dennis wasn't sure why at the time, but he decided to open the door. The figure stepped forward and introduced himself as Private Doyle. Dennis told him that he was armed, and the private nodded, saying it was fine, but they both needed to leave as soon as possible. Dennis asked what he was talking about with the army retreating, and Doyle promised to explain everything as they went. Dennis walked through the house, gathering his gear while Doyle followed him and half-answered some of his questions. Dennis thanked him for helping take care of that monster, but kept his gun in his hand, and made sure that this Doyle person was always aware of it. Dennis asked why he had a gas mask on, but the answer Doyle gave was too muffled to fully understand. They finally came to the last room. Dennis felt a ping of sadness. He'd planned to leave in the morning anyway, but still, actually leaving was hard. To distract himself, he asked where the army was moving, and Doyle responded, "South." Dennis froze. South? Towards Mexico? Towards the necropolis? Dennis asked why they would go that way, and Doyle answered that a large horde of mutations were migrating down from Canada, and even if they were getting smarter, Seekers were still better to fight than mutations. Dennis felt his heart skip a beat. He called them Seekers. There was only one person who had ever called them that before. He looked at Doyle, and the private tilted his head in confusion. Dennis asked him where he had heard such a term before. Doyle was silent for several seconds, and then told him, "You said it in the other room." The two stared at each other, and Dennis asked Doyle what his name was. Doyle responded, "Private Doyle." But Dennis demanded what his first name was. Doyle was again silent, before finally saying he was so sorry for them being split up that morning. He was sorry that it took him so long to finally get back to him. Dennis backed away, with tears almost in his eyes, while Nathan took a step forward and began taking the gas mask off. Dennis backed until he felt the wall against him, shaking his head begging for this to all not be happening, even as he saw the lifeless, discolored face of his friend. Nathan reached out and grabbed hold of Dennis and muttered through drooling lips that there was good news even in this bleak world. And as Nathan bit down into Dennis's shoulder, he softly promised, "Mother Aya loves you."
Poor fellow. It's always such a pain in the neck when family shows up abruptly. Still, I think Mother Aya will be a very positive influence on him. She always says to keep calm and carry in. And also, donect itorum convenient.
Shit,